She left this world peacefully, with a smile on her face. "That's good to hear," Preacher said. "I never knew a finer lady. I miss her. Every time the sun rises or sets, every time the wind blows, every time I hear a wolf howl or see a bird soaring through the sky, I long to be with her again. But when the day is done and we are to be together again, we will be. This I know in my heart. Until then—" Two Bears smiled again. "Until then, I can still see her in the fine, strong sons she bore me, and the daughters who have given me grandchildren." He nodded toward a young woman standing nearby, who stood with an infant in her arms. "You remember my youngest daughter, Wildflower?" "I do," Preacher said, "although the last time I saw her, I reckon she wasn't much bigger'n that sprout with her." "My grandson," Two Bears said proudly, "Little Hawk." Preacher took off his battered, floppy-brimmed felt hat and nodded politely to the woman. "Wildflower," he said, "it's good to see you again." He looked at the boy. "And howdy to you too, Little Hawk." The baby didn't respond to Preacher, of course, but he watched the mountain man with huge, dark eyes. "He has not seen that many white men in his life," Two Bears said. "You look strange, even to one so young." Preacher snorted and said, "If it wasn't for this beard of mine, I'd look just about as much like an Injun as any of you do." Two Bears half-turned and motioned to one of the lodges. "Come, we will go to my lodge and smoke a pipe and talk. I would know what brings you to our village, Preacher." "Horse, the same as usual," Preacher said, as he jerked a thumb over his shoulder toward the big gray stallion that stood with his reins dangling. A large, wolf-like cur sat on his haunches next to the stallion. "How many horses called horse and dogs called dog have you had in your life, Preacher?" Two Bears asked, with amusement sparkling in his eyes. "Too many to count, I reckon," Preacher replied. "But I figure if a name works just fine once, there ain't no reason it won't work again." "How do you keep finding them?" "It ain't so much me finding them as it is them finding me. Somehow they just show up. I'd call it fate if I believed in such a thing." "You do not believe in fate?" "I believe in hot lead and cold steel," Preacher said. "Anything beyond that's just a guess." Preacher didn't have any goal in visiting the Assiniboine village, other than visiting an old friend. He had been drifting around the frontier for more than 50 years now, most of the time without any plan other than seeing what was on the far side of the hill. When he had first set out from his folks' farm as a boy, the West had been a huge, relatively empty place, populated only by scattered bands of Indians and a handful of white fur trappers. At that time, less than 10 years had gone by since Lewis and Clark returned from their epic, history-changing journey up the Missouri River to the Pacific. During the decades since then, Preacher had seen the West's population grow tremendously. Rail lines crisscrossed the country, and there were cities, towns, and settlements almost everywhere. Civilization had come to the frontier. Much of the time, Preacher wasn't 100% sure if that was a good thing or not. But there was no taking it back, no returning things to the way they used to be. And besides, if not for the great westward expansion that had fundamentally changed the face of the nation, he never would have met the two fine young men he had come to consider his sons, Smoke and Matt Jensen. It had been a while since Preacher had seen Smoke and Matt. He assumed that Smoke was down in Colorado on his ranch called the Sugarloaf near the town of Big Rock. Once wrongly branded an outlaw, Smoke Jensen was perhaps the fastest man with a gun to ever walk the West. Most of the time he didn't go looking for trouble, but it seemed to find